Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. I'm joined today by Alden Rosario and Dr. Phil Hendrix. We're going to be talking today about custom GPT AI, which is the company that Alden founded. And we're also going to be discussing a white paper that Phil wrote with others about what's emerging around custom chatbots and some of the work that they're doing. We'll get into some case studies and get into all of that in the conversation. Before we do any of that, I just want to welcome Alden and Phil to the show. Welcome to Trending in Education.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, Michael.
It's great to have you. You're right in our wheelhouse lately. 2024, I have done more AI shows than any other kinds of shows, and many of them involve some of the capabilities that you're building with custom GPT AI. The website is customgpt.ai. To get us going, Alden, let's start with you and hear your origin story, and then we'll pick up right after that with Phil's.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us, Michael. So our story started about 18 months ago when the Chat GPT thing came out and it caught on fire. And we had this vision which said that, if Chat GPT is cool, what would be even cooler would be if people can build Chat GPT with their own data.
Hmm.
And that's how customgpt.ai got started.
Right.
Time, what we realized as we talked to universities and customers from all sorts of segments, we realized that things like accuracy, trust, accountability, hallucinations,
Yeah.
all of those factors really matter.
Hmm.
And so we started building solutions that were more focused towards those businesses and the types of things that businesses really care about.
Yeah. And we'll get into more of the detail there, but this is where explainable AI and the idea that, responsible AI, basically understanding what you're putting in front of your customers or your students in the case of higher ed, your faculty, your staff, that you actually trust what it's putting out there. You're avoiding some of the risks, some of the cautionary tales that we're hearing nowadays around when AI goes off the rails. In some ways, controlling the data set helps keep things on the rails, which is something folks generally are looking for these days. And then, Phil, I mentioned higher ed. That is an area that both of you are really looking at. And I know it's a little bit of your background as well. Can you catch folks up on your background and how you got to this point in your career?
Sure. So I'm Phil Hendrix. I'm head of IMMR. It's a research consulting firm based here in Atlanta. And I advise both startups as well as enterprises, a mix of the two. And I met Alden about 9 months ago when I learned about customgpt.ai. And I thought, wow, this is cool. I've since built two of my own custom GPTs, but we began collaborating and I worked closely with him and his team, identifying not only market opportunities, but developing some materials that help them go to market and the like as well.
Hmm.
Higher ed obviously is one of the primary markets for the kinds of things that custom GPT does. And we've tried to encapsulate some of those opportunities and also describe in the white paper, not only the leading edge that custom GPT represents, but other capabilities around generative AI as well. And finally, just a shout out to Emory and University of Michigan. I did my PhD at Michigan, go blue, and then taught at Michigan. I had a joint appointment with the Survey Research Center, ISR. I love Ann Arbor, but it was far too cold for me since I'd grown up in Florida. And then we moved back south, and I was on the faculty at Emory before moving into consulting at least a couple of decades ago.
Yeah. And I believe if I heard you right, you are a recovering academic. So you still have some of the academic bona fides, but you've moved back out into the private sector as a consultant. What's really interesting there, and you were touching on it, is that you've been spanning both enterprise and higher ed, which to me is an interesting intersection point because frequently enterprise moves further faster and higher ed frequently is a little more cautious. And your white paper is speaking specifically to that. You're trying to kind of identify the different archetypes that are out there, the different places that a university or an enterprise might be in terms of its readiness to adopt AI. I thought that was a good place to maybe dig into next, where there is this white paper, and this white paper is kind of framing up the different kinds of footing that might be out there for universities. Can you talk about what led you to writing the white paper and some of that framework that is in there?
Sure. So three things. I think first and foremost, there's recognition that the workplace that the students are entering as they leave college or university is changing dramatically, and universities need to prepare them for that. Secondly, faculty, of course, always are struggling to balance research, teaching, and service. And the question is, how do we do that more effectively? So, questions not only around efficiency, but I think third, and perhaps even most important, generative AI in particular will change the way in which education at large, but particularly in higher ed, will be delivered. So this question of how that gets done, I think, is intriguing. We're learning a lot about it, and we have some case studies early on that illustrate potential. But I think we're in a period of disruption that will be transformative in ways that we can only begin to imagine.
Yeah. And then in terms of the case studies, Alden, you've been in this space from the ground floor. You've been working with a bunch of different clients within higher ed and elsewhere. Can you highlight perhaps some of the use cases, some of the ways in which folks are using custom GPT AI? Because it sounds like it's pretty flexible and you can kind of tailor it a bit to your individual needs.
Absolutely. For us, the best case study was one that was started almost a year ago, and it was MIT who came to us and started using our platform. They've been a great customer for us, and they used the platform to bring in 6 different knowledge bases to create a single custom GPT,
Hmm.
right? They had these 4 different types of site and a couple of hundreds of YouTube videos, and I believe some audio and podcasts as well.
Hmm.
Well, you had disparate knowledge spread across the enterprise, and they needed that put into one custom GPT
Hmm.
that can answer questions related to the topic.
Hmm.
In this case, this was their entrepreneurship center, and they wanted to create basically a chat GPT with curated, trusted, ground truth information.
Hmm.
So that's what kicked off their engagement with us.
Yeah.
Uh, Interesting thing that happened was they had a very high bar for the trustworthiness of the responses. They had a brand that they need to uphold, and whatever the AI is saying, better adhere to that brand and trustworthiness.
Yeah.
So they pushed us to create one of the best anti hallucination solutions
Yeah.
where they had an extremely high threshold for not making up facts or providing answers that were not from the ground truth information.
Yeah.
Was a fantastic engagement for us where we were able to work with them and get that deployed. The best part from a democratization perspective was all this happened with no developers.
Hmm.
So they did not require any AI engineers or developers on their side.
Yeah.
I was not involved. It was literally the entrepreneurship center. They built it themselves. They logged into our platform, and using just a browser, they were able to build this AI out,
Yeah.
which is important because the moment AI engineers and
Right.
IT involved, price point goes from a couple of thousands of dollars to
Yeah.
like millions, and then you get all sorts of crazy things happening.
Not to mention the shared governance in higher ed and the silos that make knowledge management complex. They make implementation of technical solutions equally or more complex because you have to be aligning all of your efforts and making sure you're getting approvals and working through your IT department. Where, I imagine in this case, they have to work through procurement, but then once it's licensed, they can use it however they need to.
So in this case, they were able to actually just use their credit card,
Hmm.
execute it
Nice.
a matter of hours,
Yeah.
right? And that is why it was able to go from idea to deployment
Yeah.
just a matter of couple of days.
And then just to clarify for our listeners, when you say, a custom GPT, you're interacting with a chat interface to access the knowledge management, all the different information that's really spread across the enterprise.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
There are two components. One is platform where you log in, you add your data sources, and you build the platform,
Yeah.
build a chatbot. The second part is where you then take that chatbot widget, deploy it onto your own website.
Yeah.
You don't have to have your users go over to ChatGPT or anywhere else. They seamlessly become part of your current
Yeah.
experience.
And what's interesting about that to me is I'm always trying to understand the human component in the workflow. And to me, what you're describing is more what us humans will be better at, which is kind of curating the data, keeping it clean, validating the response, doing some user acceptance testing before you release it into the wild to say, yes,
Exactly.
this did actually meet my threshold. And in some ways, it sounds like you were fortunate to have a great brand with a high threshold early on, which kind of burns you in with a level of rigor that helps you stand up to the challenge. One of the things that we talked about on the show is that generative AI went through a honeymoon phase, a peak of inflated expectations, and now arguably we're entering into a trough of disillusionment where there's more negative framing to stories. We have covered the LAUSD's rollout of Ed with All Here that had a lot of problems. And that's where I imagine where you're positioning yourself is somewhat in response to that, where rather than roll this out without guardrails and without the right checks and balances to ensure reliable, safe, trustworthy delivery, you actually have that baked into your product.
Exactly. Exactly. So, our customers like MIT, and then like after that, there were a host of other universities and some K-12 too that came in. You know, they made it very clear how responsible AI is very important to us. So we literally spent like thousands of engineering hours dealing with hallucinations. It became a key aspect of our system. In the old world, things like database security were very important, right? And for AI, hallucination is the equivalent of like security in
Yep.
the
Yes.
SaaS.
Yeah, it's one that I've covered too, just because the language around hallucination does have some anthropomorphic. It basically imagines like the AI as a human intelligence when it's really not. Hallucinating implies that you're actually perceiving something where, in some ways, it's almost like confabulation or just generating something that is untrue. Misinformation is another way I've heard it characterized. And that's where another thing that, we've touched on in the show, and I was happy to see you referencing it in your white paper, is the idea of a RAG or retrieval augmented generation from a more technical lens. Can you talk us through some of the ways in which, you mentioned before, perhaps having a more controlled data set to begin with, but then it's a combination of that and then also using other technical controls to make sure that what the output of the GPT is actually safe.
Exactly. So hallucination is where the AI starts making up stuff. At the end of the day, the AI is sort of like a giant autocomplete,
Mhm.
right? So if you say Mary had a little lamb
Yeah.
or Mary had a little, it's guessing the next word. And in some cases would, confabulate or make facts up. Best way of dealing with this is to first supply your ground truth information
Mhm.
to the AI. And then systems like ours are designed to stay within that ground truth. So, in the example that I gave, if your ground truth documents is saying Mary had a little goat, it is then the job of our platform to make sure that it answers with Mary had a little goat.
Right.
Technical side, what we had to do was a couple of things. From technical side, we had to go into the AI aspect. This is called RAG, and build in certain anti-hallucination checks
Mhm.
in how the AI is responding, how the data is being ingested, what data is being fed to the AI to create the response. In a RAG pipeline, there are about 5 modules that have to be controlled for hallucination
Hmm.
and make sure that the bot is not hallucinating.
Right.
And I'm pretty thrilled that we were just benchmarked as the number one for anti-hallucination, beating out OpenAI, Google, and a lot of the other systems. I'm very thrilled that we made it a core priority of the company,
Hmm.
stuck to it. And what we are seeing is the customers come along, like universities, law firms, SaaS companies. For them, this is a very important feature
Yeah.
that we want to concentrate on.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'd like to get back into more use cases in a bit. But before we do that, Phil, I saw in the white paper there was this breakdown of different kind of mindsets and readiness levels that you're seeing across higher ed. The white paper has a nice graphic even signifying this. Can you catch us up a little on, your methodology for getting the white paper together and then what you began to discover as you were looking at higher ed's readiness to adopt generative AI and develop things like custom GPTs?
Sure. So the roadmap I actually published back in February, and then I've done some work with enterprises mainly over the last 6 months, where we've corroborated the roadmap. And basically, what the roadmap shows are milestones along the path from literally just on the fence and thinking, is this something we really need to focus on, or can we put it on the back burner, to getting started, and then beginning to gain traction and ultimately scaling and embedding AI in your DNA. And
Mhm.
quite frankly, that's aspirational. But most organizations, higher ed included, are really just getting started. Some have advanced beyond that, but most are sort of stuck there because, quite frankly, there are large steps and leaps from one stage to the next.
Mhm.
But if we think about higher ed in particular, it's really fascinating to think about the levels at which something like custom GPT.ai can be employed. They range from individual faculty members teaching courses, and they may have multiple courses, and therefore custom GPTs for each of those, to schools, but equally important outside of the academic side are all of the student services functions
Yeah.
across the university, and then the operations of the university, the back office, if you will.
Mhm.
So one of the case studies we can talk about is the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, where
Mhm.
proposals are being reviewed for compliance and things of that nature. That's a classic use case. And then we have others ranging from sports and what's going on across the university to how do I access healthcare and things of that nature. So if you think about sort of the university as a mini city, if you will, it's got all of the interactions and services that one would encounter anywhere else. But on top of that, you got the core focus on teaching and learning.
Mhm.
So it's fascinating to think about the applications. The one that Alden just mentioned represents a lab or a research center. But then at the university level, we actually have some universities using it for their websites as a whole. And
Yeah.
the common thread there is a corpus of data or content that's being integrated into a custom GPT
Mhm.
and presented to users, typically students, but others as well, in ways that make that interaction, one, much more interactive and engaging and meaningful. But on top of that, it surfaces data that at this point are by and large locked in wherever strongholds the data reside.
Yeah. The thing that makes me think about is mental models, which is something we've been talking about increasingly on this show. There is the model of search, and I go to Google and I type into a search box, or I go on a website and I type in a search box, and it gives me results, and I go to those results. That had been the prevailing model for 20 plus years. Now, I think a new model, OpenAI just released its version of search, the GPTification of how we interact with information is something that, independent of how it's provided to you, more just the interface, the model of how I engage with information is now much more driven by chat dialogues. And that's why, you know, creating ways for folks to develop their own custom versions seems right on the money. And it's also a place where I could see genuine value to not being too big, because one of the challenges with the large language models is you've scraped everything, including a lot of junk and a lot of stuff with questionable intellectual property rights. There are a couple of suits that are out there against, OpenAI right now already. New York Times and Universal Music Group are questioning what actually went into the initial data collection. in a lot of ways, you're a response against that. You actually have a different model in terms of your underlying architecture.
Absolutely. And the underlying architecture starts with your curated data,
Hmm.
right? And that is why one of the key features of our system is that if it doesn't know the answer, it'll just say, sorry, I cannot answer because I don't have enough information. One of the most common things that people do with our system is after they are done building their custom GPT, they go and ask some random question like, why did the chicken cross the road? And it's supposed to correctly say, sorry, I cannot answer this question.
Yeah. And that's the part that's been really interesting more from a product design perspective. The ways in which you almost convey a personality. There is an emotional element to the design where you're trying to build that trust. Just from my own anecdotal experience, I feel closer to Claude than I do to Gemini. It actually feels like there's more of something on the other side. It also feels like when I coach Claude, I get better response than what I get from, say, Gemini, although Gemini is more integrated into my Google Workplace. So, like, there's all moving sliders in terms of what I get out of this. But what I have found as, a solopreneur is that some of the value proposition of what you're providing with custom GPT AI is interesting to me as someone who's generating a corpus of data. Every podcast episode that I do is generating a transcript. That corpus is the type of thing that actually could be used to train a GPT. And that's not unique to me. I think a lot of us maybe forget that we are content developers. We're developing a corpus of data. We just don't necessarily understand how we would train something with a tool like yours.
Exactly. And you'll be happy to know that we have a feature to ingest podcasts.
Nice.
It was important to me that creators like you are able to do that without requiring technical help.
Yeah.
We built the data ingesters to be able to do that. You touched on a very nice feature, Michael, which we call the persona,
Mm.
wherein the other aspect of a custom GPT besides the data is how the AI should behave. And in your case, when you build a custom GPT with your podcast, you want to control the tone, the personality,
Hmm.
and also maybe you want to have some call to actions, whatever the behavior of the AI is, you want to be able to control that. And our system lets you do that
Hmm.
in English.
Yeah.
So we have these tools where you can say, I want this GPT to behave like Michael Power. These are my tones and styles. And
Yeah.
I want you to always help guide the user towards my course or your call to action. That's the second part of the AI that's going to start becoming more and more important because, as you said, besides just being an answering engine, it now needs to drive return on investment.
Hmm.
Can it drive leads? Can it drive sales?
Can it replace low value human endeavors? How something like this would relate to a contact center. My wife is an academic librarian, and we talk about, being on reference duty. You're literally humans waiting for people to chat reference questions to you when a lot of that first line of defense, at least, I imagine could be handled by a custom
One university that deployed us in their call center
Mhm.
for the business school,
Yep.
they reported that it had a dramatic impact on their sales agent.
Yeah.
When a sales agent is on a call, if he has access to a GPT like this,
The real magic of these capabilities come to play when a student is working on an assignment and they're trying to understand something, and now they have the capability to go back and not only listen to the professor's presentation, but actually ask questions about it, and more information is brought in a way that's at that student's level that helps them understand. So that personalization that not only matches the tone and style, but also corresponds to the student's level is incredibly impactful.
Yeah. And I liked where Alden was going too, where, in some ways the GPTs can be facing both the student and the faculty, and they would be seeing different things, but it would ultimately enhance the interaction. That's another thing I've been hearing more about is where can AI actually make human connections deeper, make human time, better utilized, and ultimately lead to better outcomes for everyone involved. We've been talking about custom GPT AI. I'm here with Alden de Rosario and Dr. Phil Hendrix. We've been talking about their white paper, which we'll include in the show notes for this episode. I'd love to get a little more of your forward looking thoughts on this, where, it's been a very rapidly developing universe over the last 18 plus months since OpenAI hit and was widely adopted. I think it has changed a lot of our fundamental understandings of technology and software, even human thought, among other things. And we're really still kind of in the early innings here. So, looking ahead, what's on your radar? What are some things that perhaps our listeners should be on the lookout for?
A couple of things that I'm seeing more immediately, these systems are turning out to be a great source of customer intelligence, basically. The real goldmine of information is for the professor to see how the students are using this,
Mm.
right? So when I was talking to one of the universities, they said, the best thing we love about your system is that we can now go and see how the students are actually interact.
Yeah.
And the key thing to remember here is that AI is non-judgmental. So a student who might be scared or shy to go to a professor will gladly interact with an AI because it's a judgment-free zone.
Hmm.
And that means that the professor can learn a lot from looking at how the logs and the chat of how the students are interacting.
Yeah.
The second thing from a little more future perspective is this concept of personalized AI is going to start taking off.
Hmm.
Uh, I've seen, the OpenAI scientist, Andre Karpati, he created a new ad tech startup now to create a true AI tutor, right? And those are the types of things that will be very important. I had a case study where we developed a AI tutor for underprivileged kids. And one of the learnings from that was how each child is different. But the good news is that AI can adapt to that,
Hmm.
right? If you are a fast learner, AI can adapt to that. If you are dyslexic, AI can adapt to that.
Hmm.
If you are example based versus structured, AI can adapt to that.
Yeah.
One of the big things that I see happening is how AI will be personalized towards each student.
Hmm.
That will make a big effect because, as you can imagine, you can't put a student in a class with 100 people and expect all 100 to be the same. Like, some have English as the second language, some are dyslexic, some are slow,
Hmm.
some like a different style of teaching.
Right.
This helps people adapt to that.
Yeah. Even language localization is huge. The implications there, where the same knowledge base could be available in a local language. That used to be a heavy lift. Now, especially with tools like yours, that's stuff that's becoming much more at our fingertips. We just need to know where to look.
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at the MIT deployment, when we look at our deployment, it's so great to see that the content will be in English, but the people chatting are in like 20, 30 different languages. Could never be done before.
Mike, we
That's
haven't touched on another whole realm of applications, but I think they're critical. And got a case study for you as well. So if we think about research, there's a whole set of data that are unstructured, and the question is, how do you get your arms around that and begin to
mm,
incorporate it in ways that allow us to go beyond qualitative research? So
mm,
we
mm.
got a proposal from a group of researchers at UC Berkeley in the Department of Scandinavia. What they're doing is examining recipes that go back centuries, bringing those data into a database, investigating the data with custom GPT.ai, and now they're in a position to look at this unstructured data that again is in multiple languages over time, and they can analyze that in ways that they would typically have analyzed other quantitative data. So if
Yeah.
you step back and think about all of the qualitative data, not just in the example that I've just cited, But in healthcare and social sciences at large, we have another faculty member who's developing a chatbot that will help children get help with stress, for example. So again, the range of applications that involve data that are unstructured is largely untapped. So I think
Yeah.
that's going to be an enormous set of opportunities going forward.
Yeah. And it does beg some questions. That's where your research background, Phil, makes a lot of sense here too, where, folks may even have a data set, but they may not have a way to measure what's working and to understand how to identify the right use cases and problems to apply these types of AI solutions to. It's a space that you've been spending a lot of time in. I'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on how can folks kind of structure their operation so that they can measure what's working and continue to tune and refine the implementation, because there'll be small failures that will lead to large successes, and you kind of need to go in with the right mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of use cases, we're sort of where we were when the App Store was just announced. We don't really have a full appreciation of what these things can do.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you can imagine a whole set of applications emerging that are largely exploratory. Let's figure it out and begin to play with it and experiment with it and so on. And that's important both for faculty, administrators, as well as the students themselves. So if we go back to the premise of the white paper, one of the premises is higher education is the ideal place to begin to explore, test out, and implement applications of AI that work. But that implies that we have some set of measurements. But the key is, again, to use case is to have a very clear user in mind, a set of objectives that are measurable. But again, those applications may vary over time from exploratory, let's play with it, see what works, begin to gain some learning, to more quantifiable objectives to help us understand how is this affecting things like continuation from year 1 to year 2 to year 3?
Hmm.
We know that's a big problem in higher academics. So beginning to build in those metrics, we're seeing the more advanced enterprises do. At some point, universities will as well. So
Hmm.
what we're advocating really are two tracks. One called a jumpstart, where you begin to explore, test, prove out, if you will, but over time evolve some of those applications that have high value, high impact into more of a quantifiable stream of work as well. And that requires a more disciplined, orchestrated approach, if you will. So a two-prong approach, which involves both the jumpstart as well as mastering these competencies that allow them to operate much like other enterprises are operating, is critical.
Yeah, and that allows you to engage both the early movers, the early adopters, the tip of the spear innovators, and then at the same time continue to educate and elevate the entirety of your enterprise. There can be also a separation then if you're not done right, where the early adopters are really far afield and then the rest of your organization is kind of stuck in the past. And those are certainly concerns, I think, when you're engaging with folks higher ed and everywhere else. We're getting close to time here. It's been a wonderful conversation here with Alden de Rosario and Dr. Phil Hendrix talking about custom GPT AI and other things. As folks head back to the rest of their lives, I'd love to get some parting thoughts, maybe beginning with you, Phil, and then concluding with you, Alden. Any takeaways, any ideas you want to make sure folks hear again before they head back to the rest of their lives?
I would just reiterate, and this is a point that I hammer home time and time again in the white paper, colleges and universities really have an obligation to embrace this aggressively and begin to learn not only what's working, but what's not. We didn't talk much about the risk. There are lots of risks that need to be taken into account, but I think the larger risk is inaction
Mhm.
or complacent and slow going approach. So again, the obligation in my mind is clear. And if universities and colleges don't step up and meet the needs of their students, they're really not serving their students as they go out into a workplace where the expectation is students not only will have been exposed to these things, but they will have learned how to interact, work with them in ways that really leverage the best of what the human can do along with what AI can do.
Yeah. This is coming at a time when higher ed is facing some real existential threats when it comes to enrollment, when it comes to mistrust of the institutions themselves are being questioned in new ways. So there's a real opportunity to kind of address those things directly by leaning into some of what's emerging, learning from it. Alden, final thoughts as we wrap up here?
Absolutely. My main advice for the higher ed would be take a crawl, walk, run, fly approach. There was this concept that AI is very expensive to build and we need to spend millions of dollars on NVIDIA chips and all that. But what we've shown is that you can democratize the AI and have anyone be able to do it for a couple of $1,000.
Yeah.
So my primary advice would be to dive into use cases, spend a couple of $1,000, do the crawl, and then start flying and doing the personalized AI and all of that.
Yeah. It's the opposite of war games. The only way to lose is not to play in this scenario. And then also, I think it feeds into your own fear and your imposter syndrome if you just don't start. That's where the mindset part I think is really important. Where how do we break through to people so that they understand the startup costs, to your point, are not prohibitive. In fact, it's almost more dangerous not to be doing a little bit of experimentation because then you're an informed customer, an informed user, and you can start to be in command of how you're using these emerging technologies.
Exactly. It's just like the internet, right? We started using it ourselves first and then enterprise use cases emerged. People are not going to do the crawl part with the AI. It'll be very difficult then start scaling up and run bigger tests.
Absolutely. It's been an amazing conversation here with Dr. Phil Hendrix and Alden do Rosario about custom GPT AI. We'll include a link to the white paper in the show notes. Thank you both for joining me on today's episode.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us, Michael.
And for our listeners, hopefully you enjoyed what you heard. If you did, please write us a review, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.